Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to my PIKETTY, who's our most distinguished guest here in Trento. My name is Francesco MANACORDA. I write about the economics, for the La Repubblica newspaper, and I'm sure that Thomas PIKETTY doesn't need any introduction because he's very famous, much celebrated, and a lot criticized as well. So I'll be introducing the speaker shortly, and then I'm going to give him the floor straight away. As you know, PIKETTY is very famous for two books of his. One is A Capital in the 21st Century that he published in 2013, and the second, which is more recent, is Capital and Ideology that was published in 2019. The Capital in the 21st Century was a book that marked a watershed in economics theory, as he marked a history of inequalities, a very long and detailed history, especially in the European region, maintaining that the slope of inequalities that in the Second World War period picked up again. So we are now experiencing a time of growing inequalities. The second book of his, Capital and Ideology, which I believe was the source also of some of the slides that he's going to share with us tonight, is perhaps less Europe-centered as a book. Indeed, he covers ancient societies based on slavery through colonialism. There are some 1,200 pages to this book, so it is not very handy pocketbook. And should you be interested, we saw that it is in Republic and the Public that we find the highest degree of inequalities in 1780, 1790. So it is a slavery-based society with a marked inequality in income. But apart from this historical, social history that PIKETTY carries out in his book, there are proposals that he makes, and the lecture tonight reads again for participatory socialism as against state socialism. This was the title in the English version of his presentation. PIKETTY in his lecture is going to come up with a number of solutions, drawing extensively to social democratic tradition in Europe that are quite known to us. Perhaps they're going to be upsetting for the US readership, that when they're reading socialism, they're probably going to be scared to death. In Europe, we're much more used to hearing the word socialism and social democracy. PIKETTY maintains that the welfare state should be strengthened, importantly, vis-à-vis the present situation in Europe, in that the state has to be better strengthened with public health, with the minimum income being made available. And he also refers to the need for disseminate ownership of the company, and he also refers to the redistribution effort of the tax system. Is it any better? Can you hear me better now? Says the speaker. So he was also referring to tax being levied on income and property and wealth. And he also refers to temporary ownership as a concept, in that the richest, the better off, should pay taxes on income, on property, on wealth, as high as 90%. This idea of temporary ownership, and perhaps we can talk about it later on, this made me think about another temporary concept that we're experiencing, in that we have many sharing services. So the capital should be something like car sharing. So capital is not something that you hold throughout your life. You use it at a time in your life. And in a way, Professor Piketty also refers to inheritance for all principles, something of endowment for all citizens, so that with very strong tax on the richest, on the well-off, an endowment should be made available of some 120,000 euro for each young people. And Enrico Letta in Italy had voiced a proposal to give 10,000 euro, but this is basically peanuts if compared to the endowment that Professor Piketty refers to. The books by Professor Piketty are always very controversial. Indeed, there are criticism leveled against this book by the neoliberal right, and there is a piece of criticism stating that capital is to be held by the better off because those are the ones that actually made that capital. So there's no need to reallocate or to redistribute income. But then we might think that probably the yield on capital should not be considered as one way to redistribute wealth. He's been also criticized by the left, especially by the hardcore Marxists, that criticize him because he's not, or does not take up a Marxist attitude in maintaining that it is the economic structure of the society and that should dictate the rules. He indeed refers that ideologies play the lion's share, and this controversy has been war against ideologies for a number of years now. Piketty assumptions refer to participatory socialism, and yet he is not against capitalism. As a matter of fact, the small-size capitalism is in a way very well tolerated, if not even encouraged by his words. Now, I believe that his assumptions may not be achievable in the short term. And indeed, he says that this is not something that is to be achieved in the near future. But he certainly has anticipated a number of issues, and he also comes up with a solution again to the problem that we're experiencing nowadays. So for how long Western democracies have stopped granting their citizens some kind of future based on some economic security. But now, without any further ado, I think I should like to give the floor to Thomas Piketty.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and I'm very, very happy to be back. Thanks, Tito, for the invitation. It's great. We've been there with Julia for 2 days, and it's great to be back, even though it's not exactly as usual, but it's really very nice to be here. So. Let me say, so in this presentation about participatory socialism versus state socialism is partly based on some of the materials that was presented in my book, Capital and Ideology, that was published 2 years ago now. Well, 1 year ago in Italy, 2 years ago in France. So I should say very clearly, that this is an optimistic book, and I am an optimistic person, and I really stress in Capital and Ideology that there is already a long-run movement toward more equality. And so everything I'm going to present about participatory socialism, democratic socialism, is really in the continuation of this movement. This is not something completely different to what has happened since then. This is not at all. It is really very much in the continuation of a movement toward equality, which in the long run is already well underway. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to stress these three main points. One is going to be mostly, so the first point is going to be mostly about the past, and I will stress the very successful rise of the social state and progressive taxation in the West in the 20th century. And I think it's important to start from, revisiting this narrative about the past, because if we don't know, if we don't agree about some, broad principles about the narratives the way we describe our past, it's going to be difficult to know, where we want to go for the future. And I will argue, maybe not, I will not convince all of you in one day, but I will argue that the rise of the social state and very progressive taxation in some cases was a big success in the 20th century. And the second point is going to be about the future, and I will argue that, we should try to go even further in this direction. So what I will describe as participatory socialism is a system that goes even further in the direction of permanent circulation of power and property via progressive taxation, also via more workers' rights, very much in the continuation of the co-determination law that we have, for instance, in Germany, with half of the seats in the board of companies going to worker representative, and I will argue that we can go further in this direction in the future. And the two together make a system of sort of democratic socialism or participatory socialism, which is pretty different from the kind of social democratic capitalism or social democratic mixed economy that we have today. But I will argue that, it's not more different from the social democratic capitalism than we had today, than the current system is different from, say, colonial authoritarian capitalism of 1910. So, if we look at the difference between what we have achieved between 1910 and 1980 in terms of equality of rights and general reduction of inequality in many different dimensions. It's not only more access to education, health, income, property. It's also less gender inequality, less racial inequality. Although there's still a lot to do in all of these dimensions, but the transformation between 1910 and 1980 is absolutely enormous. And so what I'm describing for democratic socialism, as you say, this is not something, I'm not saying this is going to happen next week in every country. So maybe, if it happens in 2050, I'm just saying that in the long run, this is in the continuation of this evolution. It's not a sharp break, and it's so it's very important to realize that there's already, through social struggles, revolts, sometimes revolution, sometimes just through elections. You have this movement toward more equality that has been going on through the rise of social state, progressive taxation, and we can go further in this direction. My third point is that it's about other forces of pushing for change in the future. And I will stress, the role of course, global warming, environmental damage, which unfortunately, now we know is going to happen and is going to be very damaging. And, we should act much more quickly than we do. But unfortunately, catastrophic events are likely to happen and can contribute to the transformation of dominant ideology about changing the economic system. The other important force for change that I want to stress in this presentation is the competition with China's state socialism, or what the Beijing regime described as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And, I will argue that, this is a very oppressive system, but that, capitalist countries should take it seriously. And if capitalist countries basically remain stuck with some kind of hyper-capitalist view of the world, I think they are in troubles, because this system, in spite of all its fragilities and its oppressive nature, has also some strengths as compared to the capitalist model. And I think, to me, the right response is democratic socialism, or some kind of radicalization of social democracy, in particular with respect to the South. I think we have to change, when we talk about the taxation of multinationals, like today at G7, okay, this is very nice, but if it's just about getting the tax base that is today in tax haven and divided between the North and nothing goes to the south in terms of tax revenue, this is not going to get us very far, because we really have a big problem of underdevelopment in the south, and if we don't do anything, I think the Chinese model will do something about it, and this will become a very serious threat. So I think, we often talk about the battle of capitalism, but I think the battle of socialism maybe is a more relevant way to talk about it, because in order to deal with global warming, in order to deal with pandemic crisis, in order to deal with many of the challenges we have to deal, we need the state, we need some kind of public regulation. And so then, you have different views of how to organize the state, different view of socialism or social democracy, and I think that's going to be one of the key challenges of the future. So let me start with the first point, about so what I describe as the rise of the social state in Europe. So, this is how total tax revenue is being used in Europe. So this is actually an average of Germany, Britain, France, and Sweden. There are variations across countries or in Italy or whatever, but by and large, this is the general pattern that you have in Europe. So what you can see is that before World War I, tax revenue are less than 10% of national income, and mostly this pays for basically the police force, the army, the colonial expansion, very little social spending. In particular, very little education spending. Total education budget in Europe before World War I is less than 0.5% of national income. In the US, it's about 1% of national income at the time, which is twice as much as Europe, so there is a big US educational advance at the time, but still it's very small. Over the course of the 20th century, this is going to be multiplied, like for education, this is going to be multiplied by more than 10, from 0.5% of national income to more than 6% of national income today. For public health, this was less than 0.5% of national income in 1910. This is today 9% on average of national income, more than 10% in some countries. Then you have retirement, you have other social transfer. So, we've gone from less than 10% to on average 47% of national income for these four countries today. And, I think we should realize, how successful this was. This was an enormous success. This is what allowed for a huge increase in productivity, this very big investment in education, because if you only have a small elite that goes to university, that's not going to work. So if this big expansion of health was also very successful. So this allowed not only a big reduction of inequality, but also a big increase in productivity, prosperity, and this also demonstrated the fact that there are entire sectors of the economy that can be very well organized outside of the market and outside of capitalist forces. So typically health and education, we now know today that, the countries like the US who went for a private pharmaceutical company, insurance company, hospital, they spend a lot more than Europe with much worse public health outcomes. For education, nobody wants to have for-profit companies, shareholder companies for universities or schools. Well, people in Chile tried after 1973 to have for-profit schools. This was a disaster. They are now changing their constitution to make sure this will never happen again. There was a Trump University in the US, which was a shareholder for-profit company. This was a disaster. So we now know that there are entire sectors of the economy, huge sectors, education, health, but to some extent also transportation, energy, which are actually much better organized outside the profit motive. So that doesn't mean we want to get to 100% of the economy organizing, but I think this gives sufficient reason to go further than this. In particular, the stagnation, you can see the stagnation of educational investments since the 1980s, 1990s is a big historical paradox, and to a large extent a big historical mistake, because you can see that since the 1980s, 90s, we have stagnated at about 6% of national income in educational spending, in spite of the fact that the fraction of a generation going to higher education, of course, has increased enormously over this period, which means that per student investment has declined as a fraction of national income. This is not good. And I think, to me, this is the biggest explanation. If you want to explain a growth slowdown, the slowdown of economic growth, this is the explanation. You can look somewhere else if you want, but, the slowdown of educational expansion, is the most obvious explanation. You take any growth model, that's going to be the number one factor. Now, why did we have this stagnation? Well, because at some point, people decided, okay, 47% of national income, that's already a lot, so we have to stop. I understand this reasoning, but at the same time, if you stop there and health spending continue to increase, pension spending continue to increase, then you have to compress down education, that's not good, or you have to rely more and more on the private sector for education and health. This is not very good either. So, I think, in fact, in the long run, the solution is to find a way to keep increasing, which requires, of course, to pay a lot of attention about the internal organization of these huge sectors, so that doesn't have to be the state, it can be through lots of non-profit actors in health or hospitals, cooperative insurance companies play a role in many countries, or, non-profit association, or, so there's a whole discussion also in the transportation energy sector about local, involvement of municipalities and mixed public-private structure. So there's a huge discussion about the governance of this system, which is not simple, but I think there are solutions. There's also a big discussion about making the increase in taxation acceptable. So you can see, why, this huge increase in taxation, from less than 10% to 47%, was acceptable, I think, because it was felt as being fair. In particular, because this came together with a huge rise of progressive taxation. So at least, in the middle of the 20th century, when people were paying 20, 30% of tax, they knew that people at the top were paying 70, 80, 90%. So, it was sort of viewed as fair. And today, I think the problem is that many people in the middle class, feel that people at the top are escaping taxation, and this is a complete change in our social contract. So if we want to keep expanding the social state, we have to be able to implement at the national, international level, much more progressive taxation. This means, I think, turning back on a number of international rules, in particular regarding free capital flows without any common taxation or regulation, which we've signed in the past, which were big historical mistakes. So just saying a few more words about progressive taxation, we all know, I think, this evolution, but it's always important, to remember that if you look at the top income marginal tax rate, it's really the United States which sort of went very, very far. Look in 1918 already they have a 77% top tax rate. They go to 94% under Roosevelt. If you make the average between 1930 and 1980 in the United States, so half a century, you have 81%. Apparently capitalism did not collapse, or otherwise we would have noticed it. And if anything, the US productivity growth rate at the time were much higher than what they've been since then. And this is not only statutory top tax rate. I mean, here I don't have the slides, but if you go to my book, Capital and Ideology, or if you go to the website online, which is reported here, PIKETTY, PSC, NSFR/ideology, you will find lots of other graphs, and you will see in particular that if you look at effective tax rate, paid by the top 1%, top 10%, bottom 90%, there was effective progressivity, effective top tax rate at the top in the United States, were 60, 70% at this time. So it was not just theoretical progressivity, there was real progressivity. And I really want to argue that this was a big success in the sense that not only this did not prevent capitalist growth to continue and productivity growth to continue, but in fact this is also what made the general rise of taxation and the social state acceptable for the rest of the population. Because at that time, people knew that, okay, we're all paying tax, but people at the top are paying more than they do. What happened after the Reagan decade in the 1980s is that there was a huge decline in top income tax rate. So you can see the Reagan 1986 reform going down to 28%, the top federal income tax rate, whereas it used to be 94% under Roosevelt. So this is a huge transformation. Now, this was supposed to boost economic growth, of course. This was the claim that was made by Reagan during the 1980s was, okay, Roosevelt has gone too far, New Deal has gone too far, our entrepreneurs are not working anymore, we're going to cut tax on entrepreneurs, they're going to work like crazy, the United States is going to grow like we've never seen, average incomes, average wages of our hardworking American people are going to grow like we have never seen. Except that this is what we've seen. So if you look in green, the growth rate of the US economy, so this is, official macroeconomic national accounts, national income per capita, between 1990 and 2020 has grown at 1.1% per year, as compared to 2.2% between 1950 and 1980. Now, when we make this comparison, this kind of time comparison in Europe, very often people say, okay, but the post-war period was exceptional because it was reconstruction. This is true for Europe, not for the United States. Okay, in the United States, 1950, 1990 was not exceptional. It was in fact very close to 1910, 1950, and not very different from 1870, 1910. So what's really exceptionally bad is 1990, 2020. What's the explanation for that? Probably several explanations. Some people say, okay, this is the beginning of very expensive and scarce energy. And certainly in the long run, the rising energy cost, is going to put down growth, which is probably good. And probably we should have reduced growth much earlier to stop consuming all this oil and energy. But I don't think this is the main explanation for the growth slowdown of this period. I think the main explanation to me is the stagnation of educational investment. The fact that educational investment has completely stagnated since the 1980s, to me, is probably the best explanation. In any case, whatever your best explanation is, what we should all agree upon is that when you reduce the top income tax rate by 2, you don't boost growth. Okay, growth has been divided by 2, which I don't think the explanation for the division by 2 of the growth rate is of the division by 2 of the top income tax rate. As I told you, I think it's more stagnation of education. But at least we should agree that cutting top income tax rate, increasing inequality at the top in itself is not bringing more growth. And so I think it's very important to have the narrative right about the past, if we want to go anywhere in the future. And I know that's a difficult discussion about the top tax rate of 80%, 90%, but the truth, if you look at the historical evidence, is that it worked very well. And I think it's time to read the historical evidence, and then people can bring other evidence if they want, but I think it's important at least to accept that the discussion must take place on the basis of historical evidence, and not just on the basis of what people, think on the basis of nothing at all. So that's, that's what I'm trying to push for. Now, for the future, if I think of the system of participatory socialism that I describe in the future, of course, I would like to return to very progressive taxation, for instance, like this, with up to 80% or 90% top tax rate. For inherited wealth, which already happened in the 20th century, for income, but also for annual wealth, because, you need an annual wealth tax. I heard that there was some proposal in Italy by Enrico Letta to increase the inheritance tax, and that's very good, but I think it's not enough. I think you need an annual wealth tax, billionaire tax, because you cannot wait for billionaires to die and transmit their wealth to the next generation to start paying tax. That will be waiting for too long. So you have to do it on an annual basis every year, a little bit. And some countries have done it. I think we can do it in the future much better than we did in the past. And this could help pay for this 120,000 euros inheritance for all, which I propose in my book. I should say, let's just to describe the system very quickly, what I propose is that basically people who now receive about zero, well, the bottom 50% in a country like Italy receives 5% of total inheritance, and the top 10% children who are not particularly smart as compared to the bottom 50% children, you know, they receive 60% of total inheritance. So what in the system I propose, people who today receive 0 will receive 120,000, and people who today receive 1 million, they would receive 600,000. So it's still, we're still very far from equality of opportunity. And if you want my opinion, you know, I think we could go a lot further than this. You know, equality of opportunity is a theoretical principle which everybody pretends to like and to agree, but then when we come to practical implementation, people say, oh no, that's too much for the children of the poor, 120,000 euro, what are they going to do with it? You know, like if people who receive 1 million or 1 billion, you think they know what to do with it? I mean, it's a very, you know, you realize that, you know, you have theoretical principles about equality of opportunity, and then, you know, people are very conservative and sometimes very elitist, you know, against basically the poor or the middle class. So the 10,000 euro proposal by l'État, you know, again, that's very interesting, but, you know, I would say, okay, keep moving in this direction. You know, that's you're in the right track. But you know, again, I'm not playing, of course, at all the same game as l'État. You know, I'm looking at the long run evolution. He's trying to convince voters in the short run, which is a very different kind of business. So you know, I think this is complementary. The other important part of participatory socialism is this power sharing in companies. So basically, the basic idea is to say, okay, in a small company, it is okay that if you have a single shareholder who created a small company, this small shareholder, you know, should have the majority of voting rights in the company. So I believe indeed in small private capitalist property. But then as the company gets bigger and bigger, maybe, you know, you cannot have all, you know, more than 50% of the voting rights on your own with just one individual. So you need to talk, basically. You need to discuss with other shareholders or with the workers in the company so as to get a majority of the vote. So technically, what I propose here is to say, okay, we start from what has already been in place in Germany since 1952 in large companies, which is that you have 50% of voting rights going to worker representative, which is already a huge change. You know, I can tell you shareholders in France, or I guess in Italy, they would not like that at all, because, you know, workers get 50% of the voting right even without any capital share in large firms in Germany, which means that if in addition workers have 20% of the capital, or if a local government, a regional government, like for Volkswagen, have 10 or 20% of the capital, that it means that a shareholder with 80 or 90% of the capital loses majority control. So that's a complete revolution as compared to standard capitalism. But, you know, this has been in place in Germany since 1952. And, you know, I think it's working pretty well because it allows to involve workers in the long run strategy of companies in a way which I think in the end is more efficient than in France or Italy. So I think we ought to take this seriously. And what I add to this is to say, okay, we could start from this for all companies, not only large and small companies, but also on the other 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, you can put a cap. So, you know, limitation on how much a single shareholder can have in large companies. And so with the specific parameters that I have chosen here, you know, you get to this kind of profile with where above 10 workers, you know, nobody has more than 50% of the voting rights. You know, of course, I don't pretend, you know, this is the right formula, you know, this has to be experimented, this, you know, this is something which has to be debated a lot. And, you know, all I want to stress is that given already all the transformations that happen from sort of standard capitalism of the early 20th century to this kind of co-determination systems that we've had not only in Germany but also in Sweden and most of Nordic Europe with a lot of success since World War II, we can think of other evolution in this direction. Now, let me conclude with what kind of forces, you know, can sort of accelerate political change in the future. So, of course, you know, I think social mobilization, social struggles, in general, asking for more economic justice will be very important, you know, like they've always been, you know, since forever, you know, since the French Revolution, or, you know, all the social movement in the 20th century were very important. But I think climate crises, you know, of course, in the future are likely to be very important. And here, you know, what I want to stress is, if you look at total carbon emission North America, Europe, and China look sort of comparable, but if you look at the top individual emissions, basically there's not much in China, and there's a lot in North America. There's, Europe has more than China, but if you look like at the top 1% emitters, so the top 1% individuals in the world who have the largest carbon emission, which is important because on their own, the total emission of this top 1% group is more than what the bottom 50% of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, is emitting in terms of carbon. And of course, these are the people in the south who are going to suffer the most from the consequences of this emission. Now, these top emissions are very much concentrated basically in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe. I think when people see concrete consequences of climate shock in their daily life in a way that will at some point become much more brutal than what we have seen already, and I would prefer if this does not happen and act before, but at this stage it looks as if we are more in the direction of getting toward more and more brutal consequences. At some point when people see that in their daily life, I think attitudes toward free trade, attitudes towards the countries and the social groups that were, that have the biggest responsibility for the catastrophe, can change very fast and in a way that, is very difficult to expect, but, this can be an enormous change in, political, economic attitudes, which, I think, one of the possible answers is to move towards this more decommodified economic system and less sort of capitalist economic system and the kind of democratic socialist systems that I described, I think is useful. Now, the other big challenge, I think in particular for Western countries in the future, is going to be China. So a few words about China to conclude this presentation. Sometimes we describe China as just another capitalist country with a communist party. I think it's more complicated than that. First, in terms of property structure, it's important to realize that privatization in China has stopped completely over the past 15 years. So basically, this is the share of public capital in national capital in China, and this has stabilized, at about 30% since 2005, 2006. So in fact, when you think of this 30% for China, you should think about it. This is roughly an average between 50% in the company sector and 5 to 10% in the housing sector. So, if you look at the structure of national capital in China or actually in the West, half of it is housing, half of it is company, to simplify. And so housing has been almost entirely privatized in China. 90% is private, 5 to 10% is public or owned by companies. But this is the main private asset. This is also why real estate prices are very high. People are putting all they can in real estate. Because in the company sector, in fact, I'm going to return to the previous graph before that, but so this is the ownership of Chinese companies. The share of public share is actually between 50 and 60%. So, that's taking into account all sectors, traded companies, non-traded companies, the whole business sector in China. And you can see again that, this is quite different from pure capitalism, in the sense that the share of the state, is between 50 and 60%. And, foreign ownership has never been very large, but it has been going down, if anything, in the past 15 years. So you have quite a big state control in China, which comes together with a huge, hugely oppressive system, with a concentration of power. So in particular, in the end of the Communist Party, but this also comes together with a big state capacity, in the sense that when you own 50% of the company sector or 30% of the total capital of your country, this gives you possibility both at the domestic and at the international level to do regional investment strategies, to invest in energy, including clean energy, to invest in infrastructure all around the world. This puts you in a sort of strong position as a state to do something, to have objectives. Now, this is the situation of the state in the West. So this is the share of the public sector in national capital in the West. This is now negative in US, UK. So what does it mean negative? And Italy was actually the first country negative. Sorry, I have not put it here already 10 years ago. So what does it mean negative? It means that public debt is bigger than public assets. So it means that even if you sell all the public assets, all the public schools, all the public hospitals, you privatize everything, that's not enough to repay the public debt. Now, it could get even more negative. It will just mean that private owners of public debt, they own not only the equivalent of all public schools, hospitals, but they also own future rights on taxpayer money, future taxpayer money. Now, this was not like that, like look back in 1978, Western countries, had between 25% of national capital was in public hand, because this was a time where public debt was relatively low and you had a relatively large public sector. And since then, you've had a privatization of public assets, increase in public debt, so you move toward negative net public wealth, which, I think, I'm not saying the optimum is 30% necessarily like in China. I don't know what's the optimum. It depends also on the democratic governance that you have in the public sector. It's a very complicated problem. But negative is really very small. And this, I don't think, is the optimum. If you want a government to have possibilities to invest in infrastructure, etc. So, I know today with the 0% interest rate on public debt, we feel that, we don't care about public debt. But, we all know this is not going to continue forever. At some point, interest rate will increase, and zero interest rate raise other problems on their own. They feed a real estate bubble, stock market bubble, sometimes rising inequality of wealth. Okay, there's a whole discussion about this. But I think we will be wrong if we believe that, this is not a problem. I think this is a problem. I mean, the good news is that there are solutions, in the sense that after World War II, there was huge public debt, like, France, Germany, Britain had between 200 and 300% of national income in public debt in 1945, 1950. And in 1955, they were done below 20%. What happened? Of course, they did not reimburse the public debt. They got rid of it through cancellation of German foreign public debt, and also exceptional tax on large private wealth owners. In Germany, you had an exceptional wealth tax, the Lastenausgleich in 1952, which was up to 50% on large private wealth holders, which allowed for a very quick reduction of public debt. When it happened, it was a huge political fight, as you can imagine. But retrospectively, I think this was a huge success, because this is what allowed Germany and Western countries in general to start reconstruction without public debt and be able to invest in infrastructure, education. So the challenges of today are different, but I think we at some point we'll have to take some similar course of action. And again, the contrast, I think, with the kind of Chinese state socialism and state capacity could be one of the drivers for change in the future, although my own guess is that it will take maybe a few more crises before we realize that we need to change something about the way we deal with this. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Allora, ringrazio molto Thomas Piketty per la sua presentazione.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Thomas Piketty, who's been incredible. You covered a huge amount of time, and you came up with extreme proposals, very interesting proposals indeed. Now, there's time for some questions from the floor. We have a mic available, so you should wear your mask and come here to the podium. If I may, I'd like to voice a question myself, maybe 3 questions myself, if I may. First question. You showed us progressive taxation in the US between 1870 and 2020. How can we be sure that it correlates, as you said, that maybe the drop in taxes might have caused economic growth? How can we be sure that the drop in economy that perhaps was motivated by other causes triggered the reduction in taxes for the...
Can you say that again?
Okay, I'll try to say it so you won't understand me in English. How how do you think the correlation between tax rate, progressive taxation, and growth is not an inverse correlation? I mean, why is not possible that in front of a growth that is going down, the government decided to cut the taxation?
Well, no, because this happened before. It was, I show you in the graph, the big cut in top income tax rate was really in the 1980s, whereas the big cut in growth is really in the following decade. Well, of course, you have some crises in the 1970s and early 1980s, which of course, contribute to the political fight at the time. But, if you look at long period of time, which I think, when we compare growth rates, we have to compare long period of time. Because if you just compare 3-4 years, you have crises all the time, recession all the time. But if you compare 1950, 1990, with 1990, 2020, you can see that the fall in growth is really after the 1980s is a sort of period of transition. But, I don't think Reagan said, okay, I know that growth is going to be divided by 2 in the next 30 years, therefore I'm going to cut tax. At least this was not the narrative. The narrative was we're going to get even more growth with cutting the tax. And this clearly didn't work.
Ci sono domande al pubblico? Se ci sono, volentieri. La signora, poi se il signore già...
Questions? My question is as follows. I very much agree with you. I'll be very short. I wrote books. One hasn't been published yet, and the title reads, Institution for the People. So, some kind of participatory socialism. Institutions representing the people should share, should own issues as felt by the people. In the field of education, for example, why shouldn't we lend our ears to teachers, professors? Maybe you can ask a question if you have a question. Otherwise, and the same could be the attitude in local authorities. Do you think that this sharing may be achieved as with participatory socialism? So don't you think that institution could work for the people?
Grazie.
Thank you.
Sì, sentiamo ancora un attimo.
Maybe we can take another question.
In English. Okay. Allora, vorrei...
My question is as follows. Through which institutional channels do you think that you can have a higher, more marked progressive taxation? In your book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, you refer to a very low tax rate on capital to try and at least learn about them, to know where these capitals are located. Then you think about a European taxation on the capital on higher than 5 million with a very limited tax rate. In economics, you cannot have unattainable proposals. So I think, don't you think that European institutions will ever be able to raise tax rates throughout the European Union? Or don't you think that we'll just levy small percentage tax rate on the...
Do you like to answer?
Yeah, sure. So regarding the first question, I fully agree with you that, it's not, participatory socialism or democratic socialism, no matter how you call it, has to involve a much bigger set of institutions than just what I've been talking about. So in this presentation, I've tried to focus on the property system with the circulation of property, inheritance for all, workers' rights in companies. But as you said, educational institution, local government, the rethinking of democracy, the financing of democracy, the financing of the media, which Julia was talking about earlier today. I think it's really a complete set of institutions allowing, for better democracy in the end and more sharing of power, which we need to think about. Regarding progressive taxation and can we really get to very progressive taxation in Europe? Let me say two things. First, I think we need a mixture between three big types of progressive taxation, progressive income tax, progressive inheritance tax, and progressive annual wealth tax. And, I said a little bit during my presentation why, you cannot just have a progressive inheritance tax on inherited wealth because, you cannot wait for billionaires, to die and transmit wealth to ask them to contribute to tax revenue. So you need to have an annual wealth tax if you want to have a permanent circulation of wealth and power. So you really need to have the three of them. Now, regarding your question, is it, in what I have shown you here, I propose to have up to 80%, 90% tax rate on each of these three progressive tax. And your question is this realistic? Are we going to get there in Europe? I don't think we're going to get there next month or next year. But remember, political institutions are key. In the sense that, okay, today in Europe, we have a very particular kind of institution, which is a unanimity rule on taxation. So veto power on taxation. So of course, by definition, so if you have Luxembourg, with we represent 0.1% of the European Union population, which doesn't want progressive taxation at the federal level, then that's out. It was the same, in France, before the French Revolution, the nobility was the 1% of the population, had veto power on taxation, and there was no tax reform. And then at some point, there was a revolution, there was an assembly where the nobility would represent 1% of the vote instead of having veto power, and there was a change in the system. To take you a more recent example, in US history, until 1913, in the United States, the Supreme Court had decided that there can be no progressive taxation on income or inheritance at the federal level. They pretended that the Constitution said that. In fact, the Constitution did not say that. And at the same time, the Supreme Court was very happy to feel that the racial segregation in the South was perfectly constitutional, etc. This is the problem with judges when you let them do whatever they want. This can go in very strange direction. Anyway, there was a constitutional change. It took 20 years. Between 1895 and 1913, it's very complicated to change the constitution in the United States. You need 2/3 of the states to have a majority vote. But there was a huge popular mobilization with the Democratic Party at the stage at this time, which was sort of moving from being the old slavery party to the New Deal party very gradually. You had also a so-called populist party in the United States at the time called People's Party, which was pushing for this constitutional change. Finally, in 1913, there was a change in the Constitution, and the US Congress suddenly was allowed to vote for progressive tax. What happened was described on the graph before. They started with 2% top income tax rate. In 1918, they were at 77%. In 1942, they were at 94%. Because when you have a political institution that allows you to take decision at a level of a large country, you can do a lot of things, basically. So that's a little bit my answer for Europe, which is that we don't know how things will change. And, I think that's why some people are very worried to move to majority rule on taxation. Because once you get to majority rule on taxation, and once individual countries, Luxembourg and Ireland, lose their veto power, very different dynamic processes and political process can happen, and people who know how to forecast the future and who think that there will never be very progressive taxation in the future, I'm not impressed by this kind of people, because there has been so much change in the past that was not, that similar people said will never happen. I think if we look at history, we see a big movement toward equality, which I think will continue.
Bene, grazie. Abbiamo, penso, un'ultima domanda, poi anche il tempo.
We just have time for one final question.
Today, the G7 leaders have reached an agreement on a minimum global tax on multinational firms. I was wondering whether you thought this, it might be an easy question to answer, but I was wondering whether you thought this is a step in the right direction, and if so, what you think the next steps should be with regards to multinational firms, with regards to global leaders.
Okay, thanks for the question. Well, first of all, officially nothing was decided today or yesterday. It's only an announcement. There's been tons of announcements for the past 20 years about this. The only thing a bit concrete in the announcement today is this number, 15%. And people said, okay, we should have a minimum tax rate on multinational of 15%. And I think this is a pure, this is a scandalous number, because if we were all paying 15% in tax, okay, why not? But we cannot pay for hospitals, schools, etc., with this kind of tax rate. So, in fact, if you take small or medium-sized companies, in Italy, or middle-class taxpayer or lower middle-class payer in Italy, they will be very happy to have 15%. But if you look at what they pay in terms of profit tax, income tax, social contribution, they pay 20, 30, 40, 50%. And now we say, okay, multinationals, if they manage to put part of their profits in a tax haven, they will pay at least 15%. And you should be very happy. This is fantastic news, because before that, in Ireland, it was 12.5%, and now it's 15%. This is completely crazy. I mean, the fact that they describe this as something, I'm really concerned that, in fact, we are creating a new sort of legal right, in effect, to escape taxation. Because now we're saying, oh, there's a minimum tax of 15%, so it's okay. You can put your profits in tax havens. At least you will pay 15%. So we are sort of making it official that if you have sufficient capacity to create a subsidiary in a tax haven and send your profits there, then you will only pay 15%. But a small or medium-sized company or a middle-class taxpayer, they're not going to create a subsidiary in Ireland to transfer part of their profits there. So we know exactly who's going to do it. These are the biggest economic actors, the most powerful companies. So we are just making it official that the most powerful economic actors will pay structurally smaller tax rate than the rest of the country. And these people at the G7 meetings, they feel they have made something useful. I mean, this is completely crazy. They don't know what they're doing. So look, the next step is to talk about real tax rate in relation to what real people are paying. That's all I'm saying. That we have to compare with what small and medium-sized companies, middle-class taxpayers are paying, and we want the tax system at the end of the day to be progressive. And so, this means that the biggest actors pay at least as much, and if possible more, and in my view, a lot more, but at least we should all agree at least as much in terms of tax rate as the middle. So we are very far from there. The good news, and I want to stop there, is that there was a report this year that was published by the European Tax Observatory, which is a new, actually European Union institution that was created very recently by the European Commission, the European Parliament, where it was more under pressure of the European Parliament, which produced its first report this week. And one of the nice conclusion at the end of the report is to say, well, look, if we can't reach an agreement for a sufficiently high minimum tax rate on multinationals, each individual country could start applying it in a unilateral manner. So, the French government, the Italian government, the German government could say, okay, if I have multinationals who have foreign subsidiaries, in Ireland, and who are today paying 12%, I will charge them the difference between 12 and 25, 30. And this report by the European Union Tax Observatory has computed, the tax revenues that will come. So just let me give you one number. In the case of France, if you have 15% minimum tax rate, you will have like between 3 and 4 billion euro in extra revenue. If you have a 25%, you will have 28 billion euro in tax revenue. So 28 billion euros, that's 10% of total public health budget. Whereas if you have the 3 billion, it's, 1%. So, do you want 10% more nurses and doctors, or do you want 1%? At some point, you have to confront what you do, and you can also use part of the money to reduce taxation on small and medium-sized companies. You can do half and half, you can do whatever you want, but in any case, at some point you have to become real about the numbers that we're talking about.
Bene, una ultimissima domanda molto rapida.
A very final, quick question with a quick answer. The problem of inequalities in certain countries is also a generational problem. In Italy, young people will in the future have to face one of the highest public debt in the world vis-à-vis the GDP. If I'm not wrong, you proposed an initiative for the moratorium of the debt in Europe, which was not very well accepted by the European Central Bank. What are we supposed to do?
Well, it depends for which part of the debt. So, for the debt that is now in the central bank balance sheet with right now a 0% interest rate, I think it will be the good time to postpone it for 40 years, 50 years, or forever. In practice, people don't like complete cancellation. They prefer to postpone it. We could postpone it until we have solved the global warming problem, if you want. And, then we will talk more about it. There's a concrete historical example I want to refer to, which was in 1953. The foreign debt of Germany, which was mostly a post-war reconstruction public debt, was cancelled in the 1953 London debt agreement with Britain, the United States, France. But in fact, we usually describe it like this. We say it was cancelled in 1953. But if you look technically at what happened, the decision that was made in 1953 was to freeze German debt and to say, okay, we will talk again about it at the time of German unification, which back in 1953 looked like, solving the global warming problem today. and then in 1991, when German unification finally happened, there was another meeting with France, the US, Britain, etc. And then people say, oh, this is stupid. We completely forgot to index the public debt on inflation, GDP growth, etc. So now this is a ridiculously small amount. So let's cancel it completely. So I'm not saying we will do the same this time, but I'm just saying that so that people have a sense of how it works in concrete history. Because when we talk about debt cancellation or debt postponement, people get crazy, get very excited about abstract principles, but they just forget to look at history and the fact that, when public debt is very large, at some point you have to get rid of it. And when it's a 0% interest rate, like today with the debt that's on the coffers of the European Central Bank, then this is the right time to do it. Because if you wait for the interest rate to be 1% or 2%, then it's more complicated because you have some losers and gainers between countries depending on whose interest rate is a little bit above 2 or below 1, because the profits of the European central banks are then redistributed to the country. So depending on who is paying what interest rate, in fact you have some redistribution between countries. So it's much easier to freeze this public debt when everybody's at 0% interest rate. Otherwise, it will be much more complicated. But as you said, people don't like that too much. Then for the rest of the public debt, because that's not going to be the full solution, for the rest of the public debt, I think the ideal solution is the exceptional one-off wealth tax on very large private wealth owners that was done in Germany in 1952, in Japan also, and in a number of European countries. And in the case of Italy, this is one of the countries with the biggest public debt, but this is also one of the countries where private wealth as a fraction of national income has increased the most. And of course, the two are partly related because part of the private wealth is the public debt that is owned by Italians who have some wealth, and in particular, mostly elderly Italians, although within each age group you have a lot of wealth inequality, but it's mostly elderly Italian. And I think this will be very good for the Italian economy to redistribute some of this wealth to the young people, who have projects to create companies, much more than I don't have anything about the wealthy elderly, but, I think the money will be much better used. So we are back to Enrico Letta, 10,000 euros, and, let's do more than that. Let's move in this direction. But I think this is the right direction.
Va bene. Ci rivedremo.
Thank you so much. Good night.